Right, are we near enough ready? Good afternoon. Today the Council of Ministers has lodged the proposed government plan for 2021 to 2024. This plan, which will be debated by the States Assembly during the week commencing the 14th of December, represents our vision for Jersey and our commitment to protect our island's future. It sets out how we will keep protecting islanders from the risks to health and livelihoods posed by the COVID-19 pandemic, whilst ensuring we also meet the objectives we set out in our common strategic policy. When we introduced the first government plan last November, nobody could have predicted the impact that COVID-19 would have on our lives, on our community, and on our economy. The pandemic has substantially disrupted the work of governments across the globe, and this has also been true for Jersey. It has impacted on our income and created a significant increase in our expenditure. It has compelled us to re-examine the delivery of some projects, to reprioritise how we use our resources, and to rethink how we invest in our island. Protecting islanders, especially those at highest risk, remains our first priority, and we will continue to manage the healthcare challenges presented by COVID-19 as part of this government plan. We'll provide investment and extra resilience to essential services, fund the Nightingale Wing, distribute PPE, and do what is necessary to suppress the virus until a vaccine can be provided. To drive our economic recovery, we'll continue to provide support to local businesses through new economic stimulus measures and growth initiatives, including establishing a fiscal stimulus fund subject to States Assembly approval. We must also be prepared to address the long-term impact on our public finances, and this plan sets out the measured steps that ministers will take to address predicted deficits in 2020 and 2021 through sensible borrowing and repayment, with a long-term plan to balance budgets by 2024. To cover the costs of responding to the pandemic, ministers are proposing borrowing up to a maximum of $336 million next year, in addition to the Fiscal Stimulus Fund of approximately $50 million. Should the States Assembly approve current plans to move to a current year basis of taxation, then the future repayments of the 29 tax liabilities for prior basis taxpayers will repay much, if not all, of this debt. And will also continue to provide necessary investment in our essential services, especially in healthcare and education, to provide sustainable and lasting improvements. The commitments made in the common strategic policy, which underpin all a government's work, have not been forgotten. Our island's children and young people have been particularly impacted by the pandemic, with negative effects on their education and personal development. So we'll be introducing the COVID-19 Schools Catch-Up programme to ensure that we address the loss of schooling suffered by primary and secondary school students, alongside continued investment in mental health and well-being, which will also have suffered as a result of the lockdown. Our healthcare services have been successful in mitigating the impacts of the public health emergency so far, but we must continue our programme of investment and change, ensuring that we have in place a health and care system that is capable of responding to our needs in a way that is fit for Jersey's future. From 2021, we will begin to implement the Jersey Care Model, which will enable a shift to a more preventative health service through community and home-based services, enabling us to better cope with forecast demand from demographic change and to provide islanders with a more accessible, patient-orientated healthcare service. Whilst Jersey businesses have shown resilience and tenacity in the face of the economic challenges of the pandemic, we must continue to support them through recovery and as we look to grow and diversify our economy. With recommendations from the Economic Council due to be received and considered in late 2020, we will develop these recommendations on a longer-term economic renewal for consideration by States members and islanders during early 2021, and will begin implementation with the support of a new economic growth funding allocation, which is included in the government plan. Islanders whose employment and income have been impacted by the pandemic will continue to be supported to ensure that disparities in income inequality do not increase and standards of living do not worsen. And the government plan sets out our commitment to helping unemployed islanders find work with the support of targeted back-to-work programs. We will also ensure that we provide a home fit for future generations with our new island plan, which will enable us to live up to our commitment to the island's environment. This government plan also accounts for continued improvements to organisation-wide change within government. The pandemic has demonstrated the importance of working together as one government and using new technology to respond flexibly and at speed. In 2021, we will continue to invest in public sector employees, modernise our workforce, and reform how we work. And this will enable us to deliver better outcomes and more efficient services. Now, I know there will be yet more challenges facing our island and our community in 2021. While some, like the global pandemic, will be unpredictable, there are many that we can anticipate and prepare for. And this includes the potential risks to the island from a no further negotiated outcome relationship between the UK and the EU as the Brexit transition period ends on the 31st December 2020. Detailed contingency planning has been underway for quite some time and takes into account the full range of possible outcomes from EU-UK future scenarios. We are adaptable and agile. We will meet the challenges of Brexit in the same way that we've met to date the challenges of COVID-19, and with the same success. And I want to take this opportunity to once again thank all of my ministerial colleagues and the dedicated employees working across the public sector for their energy, their skill and commitment in the production of this government plan. It is a vision that will see Jersey safely through any coming challenges and provide the lasting improvements to Jersey that all of the council ministers are committed to achieving. I'm now going to hand over to the Minister for Treasury and Resources, Susie.
Thank you, Chief Minister. As Senator Fondré has mentioned, this year's government plan is all about protecting the island's future. One element of this is keeping Jersey on a responsible and stable course after what has been a turbulent year as we faced a global pandemic and economic downturn. Since the lifting of many of the lockdown restrictions earlier this year, we have achieved a balance between protecting islanders' health from the immediate effects of COVID-19, whilst also making sure we protect our future health and well-being through appropriate economic support and investment. It is also vital that we protect our future finances and ensure we prioritise the long-term financial sustainability of our island. This means that we must respond in the short term to the effects of COVID-19 by funding the essential public services needed to respond to the pandemic. In the medium term, we must support the wider economic recovery. In the long term, we must continue to invest in our future by delivering on our priorities like education and healthcare. This government plan sets out the expected costs for us to manage the virus in Jersey without limiting unnecessarily normal economic activity. This will protect the health and well-being of islanders while also preserving their livelihoods and businesses. We are, though, conscious that we need to balance the risks. A second wave in Europe and the UK and a sharp slowdown in the world economy as a result of COVID-19 has to be balanced against the risk that we cause irreversible damage to our and our children's future by introducing costly restrictions on our economy during a period of recovery. In this government plan, we'll look to balance these risks by running deficits to support spending and investment in the coming years, with a return to balanced budgets by 2024. It is our view that in these uncertain times, we should not plug our financial hole by making damaging cuts to expenditure or by drawing on the strategic reserve. Instead, and in line with the recommendations of the Fiscal Policy Panel, we are proposing to borrow up to a maximum of £336 million next year, in addition to the Fiscal Stimulus Fund of £50 million, to fund the cost of the response to the pandemic. This will be possible because of our strong financial position, low debt levels, and a high credit rating going into this crisis. But we are well aware that debt has to be repaid, and we are proposing that, should the States Assembly approve my proposal to move prior year basis taxpayers to current year basis, the future payments of the 2019 tax liabilities for prior year basis taxpayers will be paid into a ring-fenced sinking fund. This will repay much, if not all, of this debt. These payments would be time-limited and they avoid the need to raise taxes on islanders working hard to preserve their livelihoods following the necessary lockdown measures. This approach would also ensure that the debts we incur to protect the island from the effects of COVID-19 now do not become a long-term issue for the next generation of islanders, and we do our best to protect their future. I'll now hand back to the Chief Minister.
Thanks, Susie. So in summary, we have faced the greatest threat to public health and to our economy since the occupation. And we know that in every jurisdiction across the world, COVID-19 has decreased revenues and increased expenditure. To meet this challenge, we've mobilised an unprecedented financial package and provided our healthcare professionals with the resources they need to keep islanders safe. We have supported local jobs with one of the most generous co-funding payroll schemes in Europe, a 2% reduction in social security contributions, and a voucher scheme supporting consumer spending on our high street. We've also continued our much-needed capital programmes and investment to frontline services. Now, the total impact of all of what I've just said equates to more than £1 billion. And despite these challenges to revenues and to pressures on expenditure, we only need to borrow £385 million next year. Now, this may sound significant, but we've also outlined a responsible and clear plan for this figure to be repaid without any permanent rise in taxes. In the coming months, we will be making further announcements on our office strategy, we'll be lodging a new migration control strategy, and we'll be debating the preferred hospital location in the States Assembly. These significant pieces of work will complement the measures set out in the government plan and provide the direction for meeting our commitments to islanders in 2021 and beyond. Thank you very much for listening. I will now be taking questions from the media. Right, so I presume we'll go from left to right, as it were. Should we go for Ian first?
Good afternoon, Chief Minister. Thanks for all the information. One of the things which was set out in the government plan, which has been mentioned in the government plan, is balancing our books by 2024. We're going to have a lot of money to pay back. Okay, we've outlined prior year taxation. That's going to be used to settle the debt that's incurred to pay for COVID. That's about 400 million altogether. We've also were told last week that our income revenue is expected to fall by 400 million over the 2020 to 2023. Do you feel balancing our books is going to be achievable by 2024? That's a lot of money.
Right, so let's be clear. So balancing the books means that we go into surplus in 23-24. And at the moment, the plans do show that we can do that, and that's what our plan is based on. And we've done that through a whole variety of measures, part of which is we've actually reprofiled spend, what we'd planned last year to be spending over the next 4 years. We've reprofiled a lot of that to the extent we've actually shifted £80 million along, and effectively out of those figures. By doing all sorts of those sort of things, and various other measures, which are probably too long to go into for the response to your question, as I said, we get into surplus in 23-24, and the debt as a whole, we believe, as you say, if the fiscal stimulus is approved, is around for next year £385 million. That's in the context of around £1 billion of challenge. So that's the 400 million of income, if you like, and probably over 400 million of expenditure, plus, as we said, capital investment. So you've gone from here to here. And what we're then saying is of that, it's still a large sum of money. And, you know, if you were talking to me about 3 years ago about do I ever want to see the states borrowing money, I would not be in that territory. But what we've then done is we said, okay, there are people who will have a challenge this year for repaying their tax. Because self-employed, for example, may have taken a lower income this year, but they're still due their liability from last year. So what we're saying is if we rectify that, so we help them, it also helps, I'm going to guess, many people in this room who, when we all retire, have a hit and have a tax liability with less income. That's what we call this prior basis shift. It's not an increase in taxation, it's in taxation rates. It's a cash flow issue. If we do that over 10 or 15 years, we can actually generate a sum of money, which is by bringing money forward effectively, of around the same number that will repay that debt. So we're able to say we can sustainably repay that debt which we've incurred, looking after everybody, by essentially helping people in two ends of their life, like now and when they retire, and putting all that together, that will offset the debt that we have incurred.
Okay, so that's the 400 million of the spend. So what about the 400 million that we're going to lose in revenue?
No, this is taking all of it into account. So the borrowing that we're talking about, the 385 for this next year, is, if you like, the net impact of all the measures we put in place. So it's taking account of the drop in income, the increase in expenditure and all the other pressures. The only thing that we are saying that we will have to be borrowing for next year is about 385 million.
Okay, sure, thank you. You mentioned measures. There's quite a lot of measures mentioned in the plan, potential measures. I was wondering if we could maybe just speak about those a little bit. One which kind of piqued my interest perhaps was expansion of the corporate tax regime. The last time this happened, large retailers ended up paying corporation tax, whereas previously they were on a zero rate. What sectors might we expect to see considered for the expansion of the regime?
I think there's no specific plan in there. It's, as we said, there's no specific measures in place yet. What we're saying is that over the 4 years, we want to increase basically tax revenue by, I think in that area it's around 10 million, some of which is corporate. Now, by that I mean is the detail will come out. We're not announcing anything now to saying that's what we're going to be doing in 2 years' time. But for example, we have already put up what we call ISE fees. That was done in consultation with the finance industry. That's going to raise about 3.5 million. So what we're saying is that over the period of time, we're looking to raise some additional monies. Part of that, for example, we know that growing cannabis for medicinal cannabis purposes is something that's being encouraged, for example, by Centre Farnham. And we want to see how we can obviously make sure we tax that to the benefit of the island. And that would be incorporated in some of these figures.
Okay, sure. I mean, what I really wanted was to actually get some sort of taste of what was being considered. I know there's not going to be an announcement today.
It's a little bit too early to say because there are also various things. There's a thing called, which is an OECD issue, which is called Pillar 2. And we don't know what the impact of that will be within the overall taxation environment. So will that generate any additional revenue to the island? We don't yet know. So it's a little bit too early to start going into all those areas, but it's a kind of, on the basis that if our income is around, as a rule of thumb, sort of 850 million usually, or actually a bit more than that usually, to get an extra 10 million out of the kind of corporate sector should be realistic.
Okay, perhaps I'm expecting a similar response to my next question in terms of perhaps too early to say, but I might as well ask. Asset sales are mentioned in the government plan. What assets might be sold?
Right, so we know, okay, so use an example. When the offer strategy comes through, which is something I'm very much hoping to get my next update in the next few weeks, and hopefully we'll be briefing members and doing announcements on that before Christmas, before the debate, that will free up certain sites for future development. Some will be for social housing, some will be for other different types of housing, some may not be appropriate for housing but can be released. If that generates a capital receipt, that would be an asset sale, and what we're saying, the relevance of all that is in the plan in terms of dealing with the debt. Not only do we said that we've already got measures in place to repay that debt, but also we're saying that if we get any additional efficiencies that come out of the system, all capital receipts, there's no provision in the plan for any capital receipts, that will go into a sinking fund, which is to go towards repaying the debt. So, but the types of capital receipts may, for example, be sites that become clear. There are some that have been in the pipeline for a long time. South Hill is finally pretty well clear. Okay. So I'm hoping we'll be doing an announcement at some point around that, so the planning brief is ready to go. That's things that we've been working on in the background during the whole COVID crisis. Yeah. And so if they generate money, they will go into the pot for repaying the debt.
Okay, sure. Thank you. Okay, next.
Right. Freddie.
Thank you, Chief Minister. Freddie Miller from BBC Jersey and Treasury Minister as well. Thank you. Just to pick up quickly on something that you kind of talked about just there. I know you're saying no specifics yet about the extra tax measures that could be coming in the coming years. It's been alluded to. It could potentially mean corporate tax, as an example. Are you ruling out any increase in income tax or social security contributions for islanders?
So what we've said is that in terms of the latter, certainly there's nothing on our horizon for income tax. What we have said is that one of the measures we've used to help us in this whole how we dealt with funding is we've frozen our payments into what's called the Social Security Reserve Fund, which has a balance of about £1.7 billion on it. And the logic behind that is because that reserve is used for certain payments. It's built up as a reserve. It's a pool of money, if you like. And it doesn't make sense to be paying more money into a fund and effectively borrowing to put that money in when the fund doesn't need it for quite a considerable amount of time. But we also know that we've got to make sure it stays sustainable because it's very much a long-term fund. It supports all of us in this room. So what we said in the plan is one of the future pieces of work that we're going to be doing during the course of next year is to come back and say, right, what are those measures that are we going to do to make sure we start replenishing that fund? It's always long-term. So as long as you do it in the next 1 or 2 years and say, right, we've got the plan worked out, you may only start in 2023, as a guide, we can assess it each way through. We make sure as long as that reserve, even if the value drops, as long as it's still performing its function, it's okay to do. But we do know we'll have to deal with that. It is a social security fund, and therefore logic would say probably, not definitely, we might have to look at social security rates at some point in the future. But that could be 23, 24 kind of territory. It's not going to be next year. We'll have the plans for next year. We wouldn't be doing any increases next year because part of the advice from what we call the Fiscal Policy Panel is not to put taxes up next year because that will potentially cause harm to the economy if it goes as people expect. Trouble is as well, we don't yet know exactly how the Jersey economy has been affected because obviously we've had a lot of people being supported, but a lot of people have been working from home. So financial services are carried on relatively well. So it's only when we actually see the actual impact that we'll know then, and then we'll have to be able to adjust our measures accordingly. But at the moment, no plans for any tax rises in 2021, and essentially deal with the fiscal policy advice. Our time frame is probably 23-ish is kind of the territory.
So just further to that, also, obviously social security contributions at the moment have been reduced as part of the government's measures to stimulate the economy. They're due to stop being reduced, we know, in the middle of next year, but we don't know what they're going back to. Can you tell us that figure?
No, at the moment, all they will do is they will revert back to where they were. So it's back to normal for after June of next year, and it's always subject to the advice we're getting at the time. Do we need to tweak anything? Do we, what measures we need to, where we do? Part of this plan is you're dealing with a vast amount of uncertainty because no one quite knows how long the pandemic crisis carries on, and how that economic impact then continues. So, but you want to keep the flexibility in there, and that's the stance that we tried to build into this plan.
And you talked about uncertainty there. I note that there's £40 million as a kind of contingency money set aside for dealing with COVID next year, over and above what you've already kind of forecast as you think you might have to spend. Where's that figure come from? And what if things, as you're talking about uncertainty, are worse than you expect and you need more than £40 million? Where's that going to come from?
Well, we do basically what we had to do all the way through this period. So part of it, we, as in the Treasury Minister, obviously put in what in layman's terms is basically an overdraft facility, which we've only just drawn down fractionally, I think, in the last month. So if we needed to actually fund it through cash, that is there. That's partially around where the 385 is being funded from. We'd need to get permission from the Assembly, but there's scope in there. Part of it can be doing what we've done previously, which is fundamentally about looking at your cash flow and what expenditure you may or may not need to reprofile. Because part of this is all around a balance all the way through. And so there are some projects we've significantly worse. You might turn around and say, well, actually, we deferred it slightly. That project may need to go. It will be around priorities. At the moment, we're not in that territory. We've got quite a lot of flexibility. It includes the economic recovery and the fiscal stimulus funds up there as well, plus the various payments that we do through Social Security. So we've got a degree of manoeuvre. That's always been the plan, and we just have to address it as we go.
And just finally, if I could, if that's all right, just one more.
Colleagues are probably eagerly awaiting for
just
that.
quickly, you're talking about £15 million for economic recovery next year. I understand that's going to be up to the Economic Council, which has been set up to make recommendations. But what sort of things might we be looking at? And is that going to include that targeted money for hospitality that's been promised?
No. So there's three areas we need to just be clear on. So the Fiscal Stimulus Fund, which does have to be approved by the Assembly, is a short-term fund, a short-term pot of money, mainly to be basically aimed to be used up during the course of next year. The support for hospitality isn't funded out of that, as far as I'm aware. It's basically, there is some provision in the 2020 figures already, and that will go through into 2021. And then you've got the economic recovery monies, which is very much longer term. So I think it's 15 million next year. It's then 12 and 12 from memory for 22 and 23. So those are separate monies. And again, that's about longer term measures that we might want to put in place. Basically, looking at COVID, looking at the impact, looking at the fact that the impact technology has on the way we work and things like that are the measures we need to do to tweak things, essentially.
Okay, thank you very much.
Julian.
Thank you. COVID is clearly a global problem, and all the Crown dependencies are facing the same or similar funding challenges. We brought in the 0-10 tax system reluctantly to stay in the game. Now we're all in the same boat. Is now the time to revisit 0-10?
So at this stage, as of today, there are no plans to change 0-10. At the end of the day, it has served us well over. I'm trying to think how long it's been in now, but for most of my political life from memory. So, and the one thing that the industry requires is certainty and stability, and we continue to maintain doing that as part of our support for financial services. In the longer term, as I said, there are various other pressures out there. At the moment, what we're doing is we keep planning, as we always do, for all sorts of contingencies. But as of today, there are absolutely no plans to change 0-10.
Are these sums, as in the government plan to 2024, are they based on having an idea on how many people that the government will be helping? Put another way, how essential is managing the population on this plan succeeding?
No, so essentially the population assumptions will be, where they're relevant, will have been the standard that have been used for quite some time. I can't give you a number today. Well, if you need it, I'm sure we can go and get it. What's going to be lodged, and I believe it's later next week, is what we're calling a population or migration control policy, and that's about what the changes are going to be to how people come in and how they're licensed and what their rights are. It's, if you like, a phase one, for reasons that we'll elaborate on at that time. I suspect there will be iterations as we go through that we want to get those measures in place first. There's no point in setting a policy if the controls aren't in place to back that up.
You mentioned about only needing to borrow £385 million next year. Mm-hmm. Does that include the cost of the new hospital?
No. So, so let's go two things. One is, as we said, this is purely to deal with COVID. The cost of the hospital will come through. So the debates we've got in the hospital are twofold. One is the site, hopefully in November, and we'll see if the Assembly approve that or not. And then it's a separate one. Once you've got the site, you can then get a bit more certainty around what the costs are. So hopefully we can then, and also you've been working with the developer, essentially, to hone down on the various costs so if you've got a much better idea of what that overall envelope will be. And that will be a separate debate by the Assembly, I'm going to say July next year, let's say middle to third quarter next year. So we'll deal with that at a point. The important thing, I think, is to say that we're, in relation to the debt that's in the government plan, as I said, alluded to earlier, we're putting some rules around that, essentially for robustness. And that's saying we're going to put a sinking fund together. The funds, for example, the PYB, CYB, will significantly, if not completely, contribute to clearing that debt. But we'll also be saying is if we find any additional savings that aren't in the numbers, those monies will go in. If it's capital receipts, those monies will go in. That's the plan. Now, those principles, as far as I'm concerned, would also apply to the hospital. So provided we make sure the hospital, it'll be if it is likely to be borrowing, it is likely to be a much longer term borrowing, probably 30 to 40 years, but please note this is suggestions at this stage. But equally, we've got some pieces of work that we have alluded to in the plan, which is about can we refinance, can we basically reduce the cost of what we called our long-term pension debt, which is something that is not changing people's pensions or anything along those lines, I hasten to add. It's a liability we already carry at a particular, if you like, rate of interest. Can we refinance that? It's identified. It was identified in the plan last year that work we're going to do. We're just adding a little bit more flesh around that for this year. And we're saying if we do believe, which we at present do, that it's worthwhile following, there are quite significant sums of money in there. And it might be a case of, well, that isn't in the government plan, and those monies, for example, could go into the sinking fund to repay future debt. So I think the message there is there will be a plan. It's not going to cripple future generations. It'll be, our usual prudence that Josie's renowned for, and it will be all repayable within a reasonable time frame without, leaving huge amounts of legacy debt for many, many generations.
Lastly, Chief Minister, as part of the planned 120 million of rebalancing, which is included in the plan between 21 and 24, there is a reference to both a fees and charging framework and also something called enhanced commercial services. What are these, and are we going to enter a new era of user pays?
Right, the short answer is hopefully not. But what we've said, so there's two sides to that. The commercial services side is actually building on work that's been going on for quite some time, but probably improving on it, and is actually making sure there is, for example, when we've been buying, say, PPE, and you've been trying to buy it from every jurisdiction in the world type of thing, is making sure that the commercial contracts and things like that are absolutely up to scratch. Now, some of that can be driving better pricing. Some of that can be making sure that if something goes wrong with it, you've got the contractual ability to go back to the supplier and say, actually, this is what you promised us, it isn't this, and we need some money back. So that's really about improvement in the existing position. In terms of the fees and charges, I think all of us are fully aware of the kind of level you're talking about. We have to bear in mind that it continues to be that nothing is off the table in terms of how we manage things going forward. But equally, it's trying to put a bit of a structure around what is appropriate for the different fees and different charges that we as the states charge. And so are there somewhere effectively, at present, we might be effectively subsidising an internal state's function against the private sector, but because you're disguising the cost. So that might be an appropriate time to say, actually, this is the true cost, and these are therefore the charges that need to go up. There'll be others where it's completely inappropriate to be doing a full cost, but that is really to say there's a framework we put in place, and then people will go down that framework. They're coming back to ministers at each point and saying, this is the position, what's the political view on it? Okay?
Thank you.
Gary.
Hello both, Gary Burgess from ITV Channel Television. Chief Minister, you said no new income tax rises for the prior year taxpayers. Effectively, that's a smaller number of islanders having an effective tax hike called something different to pay off this debt. If the state doesn't approve that, what's your plan B?
Plan B will be we'll have to bring an amendment back to the government plan at some point to say we will have to repay it in some different way. That could be a permanent tax increase. For the sake of argument, if you say that 1% of GST raises about 17 million and you want to get about around 30 million a year to cover that period, depends what time period you're looking at, you could be looking at GST going up to 7 or 8%. Now that would be, in my view, a permanent increase, very difficult to reverse. It hits, obviously it does hit everybody in the island, but it does hit, it is a permanent increase. Now, as I was trying to suggest, the advantage, and it's going to be a discussion, we've got an in-committee debate next week, about 2/3 of islanders, roughly, are on PYB, prior year basis. Essentially, when the system was changed, and it was under Senator Lesueur, I can't remember if he was in Treasury or if he was in Chief Minister at that point, when it was anybody coming into the system at that point in time, roughly 2008, 2010, went on to a current year. And so everybody else generally stayed on the prior year. But that balance has shifted over the last decade or so. And the difficulty is that, as we said, for those who've taken a hit in their income this year for all sorts of reasons, they're still facing the full liability for 2019, and that is due November, December this year, notionally, if we do nothing. There's also the point that for a number of us in this room, not going into personal circumstances along those lines, financial circumstances, but when we retire, it is probable that our income will fall because we're then on a pension, and you're still facing that year after your full tax liability for when you're fully earning. So this regularises that. So it's essentially we're saying no one over the course of the lifetime of a taxpayer is being asked to pay any more tax. What we are asking is, what we're saying is we take the 29 liability and we're going to take it, park it in our back pocket for a few years, probably, and it's up to individual taxpayers, probably not before 2025, and then say we'd like you to repay that to us over 10 years. Any tax you're then paying, you're then automatically on a current year basis. We've sorted out the retirement angle. We've sorted out and hopefully helped, and some people might even get a refund out of this if they're struggling, this year's problems. And actually we've said by doing that, that actually generates a one-off lump sum of cash of around 330 million, which we can also invest and hopefully get a return on. So for me, and we'll be using that expression very shortly as we wrap up, it's a very neat package because it's not a permanent increase in tax. It regularises a whole range of areas and for me, and does clear out our COVID-19 debt.
Treasury Minister, I remember George Osborne back in 2010 after the financial crash talking about ending deficits in the budget by 2015, and commentators laughed because it was tosh, and it proved to be tosh. So I'll do the equivalent now. Balance in the books by 2023-24. You're surely on another planet. I mean, that's not going to happen, is it?
No, I think I'm still based on this planet, Gary. And I think 2024 is a reasonable assessment as it stands at the moment, but from the same position that we weren't expecting any of this in the first place, we don't know where it's going to go. And we have to keep reminding ourselves that this is a global pandemic. It's not just particular or pertinent to Jersey. So as the Chief Minister's explained and is in the government plan, we've put in place all the measures that we can to secure as far as possible the future of the island for as far as we can possibly see. So I don't think it's off the planet. I think it's realistic as we stand at the moment, but who knows what might come out of the woodwork, so to speak, in the next couple of years.
And when it comes to, I know you don't call them cuts anymore, but public sector cuts, Chief Minister, and you've whopped an extra 20 million on top of the existing stuff. Is that sacking civil servants?
No. And just to go back to the other point, the key word is flexibility, by the way, because we've tried to build in as much flexibility for the next few years because of the uncertainty. If things pan out as we expect, yes, it is realistic, 23, 24 to be back into surplus. But we will know more as the next few months go. No, what we've said, going back to public sector, is we've said that we have a variety of challenges, actually, probably fair. So, for example, off the top of my head, roughly, there's about 2,000 people who are going to retire out of the civil service over the next 10 years. So we have that kind of demographic impact, a deficit type of thing that we've got to address anyway. We know that by doing things, how we've had to change things and the pace we've had to change things as a result of the pandemic, that will challenge how we work. So what I've said is that nothing is off the table and everything remains on the table. At the moment, we've not made redundancies in any shape or form, and we will try to avoid that. That doesn't mean never. That does mean it's guaranteed. It's trying to say that nothing's off the table, that we will continue to work through the plans that we've been working through. If we get the offer strategy through, we estimate, excluding productivity gains, that's around £7 million a year that should be saved each year. So if that makes it quite a worthwhile investment you should be doing at any point, let alone when you've got to be saving money. And that then in itself generates hopefully capital receipts and also sites for housing. So that is an example where no redundancies are required.
So effectively, the older civil servants facing retirement can be replaced with computers?
I think that's probably a bit too glib a comment, but it is turning around and saying that if you're going to look at productivity and you're going to look at how we do things, it is likely that as things go forward, we'll be looking at processes and systems and seeing what we can change. It may just be that you won't replace that when that person retires, you won't replace them, but you might take somebody in that covers perhaps 1.5 jobs or something in a slightly different way.
Just thank you.
Okay. Now, I've actually been told, unfortunately, we've got to keep the time short because I think we've got the next briefing. Some of you want individual one-to-ones, and then we've got another briefing, I think, at 2:30, which we've got to be back across the parade. So if we can draw a line there and just say thank you very much, we'll do a couple of words for anybody watching. And also for those who've been watching, the media have had the benefit of, I think, 2 briefings on this, if I recall correctly, hopefully on Friday, which was the easy stuff, and then today on the whole financial package that we're doing. So they've had a degree of benefit, I would say. We've actually done the same to States members, you'll be delighted to know, so your pain has been shared. But anyway, so in summary, I'm using the words, this is a neat package. And I genuinely believe that. It's all about protecting the future of the island, protecting and investing into the future of education, looking at the future for the health and well-being of islanders, and we're protecting our finances in the prudent way for which this island is renowned. We're still making long-term investments into our future. So in summary, it is the responsibility of government for now and for the future to protect islanders, but without choking off their economic livelihoods. And we believe this plan achieves this. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll draw this conference to a close.